All right, welcome everybody. Good evening for those of you on the East Coast. Come on in at 6:59. We're just starting a minute early to get everybody settled in. I know that my insiders will already know the drill. They'll start saying hello, so we'll say hello to them in a second. Welcome. My name is Justin Rivers. For those of you who are new, Chief Experience Officer with Untapped New York. We are super like exponentially times 5 excited about tonight's talk because it launches a new series that we're doing with author Tom Hynes, Wild City, based on his book, Wild City, A Brief History of New York City in 40 Animals. So this is going to be great. I don't want to say too much because it's still 6:59. So I'm going to say hello, and then we'll do official welcomes in a minute. Robin, hello. Happy Monday. Good to see you again. Elliot from Las Vegas. Janet, hello from Brooklyn. Jeffrey, hello. Jeffrey, thank you again for your email today and the follow-up email. Lorraine, howdy from Asheville. Good to see you. Christopher from Staten Island. Howie from New Jersey by way of Brooklyn. I always say, Howie, I'm reverse. By way of New Jersey. Kathleen, hi from Sherborne, Massachusetts. Santorini. Tony and Tori from Brooklyn, welcome. Anne from Birmingham. Leslie from Washington Heights. Matthew, good to see you from Harlem. Marie, hello from Astoria. Marie loves this book, Tom.
Oh, I love you, Marie. Thank you. I just want to say hi to my mother and one of my stepbrothers. I have 8 stepbrothers, but only one of my stepbrothers is on the video right now. So those are the only 2 family members that really count to me right now are Mary and Chris. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you.
They have drawn a line in the sand. All right, it's 7:01, so let me go back to my official welcomes. Again, Justin Rivers, Chief Experience Officer with Untapped New York, beginning the first in our series of Wild City. Author Tom Hynes will be guiding us through some of the really quirky stories and the animals that make up the history of New York. And today we're starting with oysters. Again, for those of you joining us this evening, please, if you'd like to chat with each other and comment, please do so in this chat function. If you have questions for Tom, please put them, it's right next to the chat tab and the questions tab, and that will make it easier for me to spot them when we do Q&A with Tom. If you're having any audio or visual issues, that's okay. Sometimes it's common with Livestorm. All you have to do is refresh your page and it'll bring you right back in. You don't have to log in. Our insiders are joining us for free. $10 a month gets them unlimited access to these talks and to our archive, which has over 100 videos strong now from when we started virtual content a year ago, if you can believe it. So I thank you all for giving your shouts out. And also, if you'd like to purchase a copy of Wild City, you can save 10% with the promo code WILD10 when you purchase from my local bookstore as well. Books Are Magic. So I love Books Are Magic. So support this. They are great. They're out on Smith Street in Carroll Gardens. I'll say a couple more hellos and then I'm turning it over to Tom. Gene from New Jersey. And a topic, not something I equate with NYC, Gene. Yeah, you will today.
Yeah.
As Robin says, the best $10 ever. Thank you, Robin. You're one of our best insiders. Well, you're all our best insiders, so thank you. All right, Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to make myself scarce. Oh, Pete from San Francisco, because this is what I'll do the whole time. I'll just keep saying hi to everybody. So I'm going to go. I will see you during Q&A.
All right, great.
Enjoy. Go for it.
All right, and everyone, and just Justin, you can see my screen all right, right? That we're leaving with that?
Screen.
I think we can. He's back.
Yep.
Great. Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here tonight. Thank you to my dear friends at Untapped New York, Justin, Nicole, Michelle, everybody there. And also a big thank you to Books Are Magic. I think there's probably a bookstore that I live a little bit closer to technically, but they are the local bookstore of my heart. So I want to thank them. So yeah, this is the first talk in our series, and some may be surprised to hear it starting with oysters, but it's a pretty foundational animal in the story of New York. We'll get started. So this right here is an illustration from the book. It is from the oyster chapter, as you can see. And this is really just an opportunity for me to give a shout out to the book's illustrator, Kath Nash. She lives in Brooklyn. She lives in Greenpoint. She's a wonderful artist, as you can see right here. She also did the cover of the book, and there are, I believe, 44 other full-page illustrations in the book. And if you ever need an illustrator or anything like that, she's a delight to work with personally. So I can't recommend her enough. So to get started on this, we're going to go back in time a little bit to 1609 in the first week of September. It is right before Henry Hudson arrives in the area. So we're really in the pre-European, pre-Columbian, Lenape native era of Manhattan, as it was called then, Mannahatta. And this is an image pulled from a book by the same name, Mannahatta, by Eric Sanderson. And Eric is a wonderful guy, a great New Yorker. He works for the Wildlife Conservation Society, which you might also know as the Bronx Zoo. This is an image from his book that he painstakingly put together with old maps and geolocation and a bunch of other things that I don't really understand. But he was able to really provide these images of how Manhattan and the rest of the city looked before Europeans came and obviously altered the landscape pretty dramatically. As you can see, there are little fires in there. I mean, it's not like it was uninhabited. It really, plenty of people lived here, but it was obviously nothing like we see now. One of the fun things that Eric points out is that if the United States had been settled by Europeans, West Coast to East Coast, and they had gotten to New York City last, as opposed to first or among the first places they landed, there's a decent chance this would have been a national park. And I think that really goes against what we think about New York. But as he tells us, there's these things called ecological neighborhoods. That could be like a swamp or a marsh or a forest. And Manhattan, the island, has 2,200 acres. And in that 2,200 acres, it has 50 ecological neighborhoods. Now, that may not mean much on its own, but we can compare that to Yellowstone National Park, which I think we all agree is like the most verdant and natural and splendid place in the world. They have 2.2 million acres. So that's 2.2 million to Manhattan's 2,200. And they have 65 ecological neighborhoods there. So it's not, they have 1,000 million times more space, and actually not that much ecological and biological diversity. So it's not even enough to say it could have been a national park. It probably would have been the jewel of the national park system. And again, that's kind of hard to believe. When we look at these pictures, we kind of get a little bit of sense of that. But New York City really had a lot going on for itself in the way of natural wealth. Obviously, there were like a ton of beavers, there were a ton of fish. But the thing that there was really more of than anything were oysters. That was what New York City, that was really its claim to fame. By some estimates, there were 350 square miles of oyster beds in the harbor. Now, that's a big harbor, but I mean, that's a tremendous amount of oysters. By some estimates, it's half the world's oysters were in New York Harbor on that day that Henry Hudson arrived. And it wasn't just there, though. I mean, it stretched from Raritan Bay in the west, in the southwest, all the way up to Norwalk, Connecticut. Up the East River and the Long Island Sound, Jamaica Bay, even the Gowanus Canal, which is that putrid Superfund site that we all know and love, used to be the Gowanus Creek, and once I guess was an ideal habitat for oysters. And the legend is that the oysters in the Gowanus Canal grew to the size of dinner plates. And I like to joke that that's a sentence that gets more disgusting the longer it goes. We're going to just move on here and just take another outside look at the geography of New York and really what makes it so special. Obviously, when we think of New York City, we're forgiven to think in a little bit of a Manhattan-centric, maybe central, northern Brooklyn-centric framework, but there's obviously so much more of it. And it's really such an ideal harbor. When you look at, we have these broad navigable rivers that could take you to Albany, they could take you to Boston, and the tip of Manhattan, is protected by the barrier island of Staten Island. It's protected by Red Hook and what is now Bay Ridge. It actually used to be called Yellow Hook. And so you really, in my opinion, you really couldn't come up with a more ideal harbor if you tried. So 1609 and Henry Hudson arrives, and obviously this changes everything. What we're looking at here is the southern tip of Manhattan. This is probably one of the first maps of Manhattan. You can see up at the top these ramparts. I believe that is the wall. That is the wall of Wall Street that gave us that name. And Manhattan and New York City really started from this small tip at the southern edge of Manhattan, and grew up and outward and into Brooklyn and then up in the sky from there. But the early founders really did love oysters, and they weren't alone, actually. The early settlers. The Lenape people that lived here previously had a way of eating oysters where they would wrap it in seaweed and throw it on a fire, which I think I'd like to try. It's not really available to most people, but I would try it. But it really did quickly become a local food favorite. And I think now we maybe equate New York City with a hot dog cart, or even the halal carts. But oysters were really that original ubiquitous street meat. You could get it anywhere. And for anyone obviously who hasn't read the Big Oyster by Mark Kurlansky, I would recommend it right alongside Mannahatta for any New York City history buffs. So, figuratively speaking, New York City was made with oysters, insofar as, they provided this cheap and abundant food source, not to mention all the jobs it created in both harvesting and cooking and exporting the oysters. But literally speaking, a fair amount of New York City is made up with actual oyster shells, including the lime used in Trinity Church. And then, of course, we have Pearl Street, which is one of the early, downtown streets that we saw on that map just a moment ago. That was, of course, named for the oyster shells that were left here by the Lenape people that predated the Europeans. And those piles are called middens, M-I-D-D-E-N-S. And those were constantly found in early excavation as the city was sort of digging out foundations and digging out subway tunnels. These were great archaeological finds that were found. So the Europeans, it's just all to say, the Europeans were not the first people to eat oysters, and the indigenous Lenape were definitely in on it as well. And the thing that was so great about oysters in New York City was that they were really loved and eaten by both the rich and the poor. They were cheap. There were things like the Canal Street plan, which was all you could eat oysters for 6 cents. They were also easy to collect. So, in those days, New York City didn't have the shoreline that we have today. You really could kind of wade out into the water. There was marshier shallows, and families could really do worse than walking out there and grabbing some oysters to feed their family. And obviously, sensing a market opportunity, New York City really began to up its oyster game. It was exporting them all over the world, and they were pulling out oysters all over the place and creating all kinds of jobs. Now, obviously, and we look back in retrospect, we see that this was unsustainable, and this was not a pace that could long endure. And what was really happening was a multi-pronged threat to the oysters of New York City. First problem was that they were over-harvested, and we can kind of get a sense of that in this picture of oyster shells that's about as tall as Barclays Center. By the early 1900s, it was estimated that 1 billion oysters were getting pulled out of the harbor every year. So that was really not something that could sustain itself. The other threat, and I love this image, the other threat was the loss of habitat. And the loss of habitat came by way of our changing shoreline. Now, if you looked at that picture of Mannahatta in the beginning, you might say to yourself, geez, that looks a little bit thinner than the Manhattan I know, and that's because it was. Over time, Manhattan has grown by about 20%, and you can see that here in this image. It's bulged out. Battery City is as new as the 1970s, the 1980s. What was once a shoreline of marshy and rocky shallows, which were ideal for oyster beds, were replaced with a nearly unbroken string of bulkheads, piers, and landfill. This was very good for real estate and shipping and maritime commerce, but it was terrible for biodiversity, obviously. And not only, we don't see it in this image, but not only did Manhattan grow by 20%, but I believe it's in Ted Steinberg's Gotham Unbound, which is another great book. He posits that New York Harbor, it wasn't just Manhattan that was growing. There are 3 Manhattans worth of landfill in the harbor. So this whole habitat has changed in a lot of ways for the worse. And then obviously the last, or another threat to the oyster populations and that wealth of oysters that New York City once had was waste management, and obviously the lack thereof. It was a devastating and nearly final blow to the city's oysters. As an example, in the 1890s, Brooklyn had this great, civic improvement project where they expanded their sewer system, and the outflow went right into Jamaica Bay. Now that sounds there's a couple things about that. We talk about Jamaica Bay as a wildlife refuge today, and that's how it's designated. And so the idea of sewage being pumped into there is a little counterintuitive. But what's actually truly troubling is that that still happens every time it rains because of our centuries-old combined sewer overflow system. So what was once a great municipal improvement to redirect stormwater and redirect sewage in this, very elegant combined way, has proven to be a thorn in our side continually. And it wasn't even until the 1980s that we treated any of our wastewater. Before that, New York City was dumping millions of gallons of raw, untreated sewage into the harbor on a daily basis. So not surprisingly, this was very bad for oyster beds. It was bad for actually, all creatures. And not surprisingly, by 1921, the New York City Health Department closed the Jamaica Bay oyster beds. And this was really a foreshadowing event of what was to come, and what was to come rather quickly. And those beds were themselves, just the Jamaica Bay beds, were responsible for 80 million oysters a year. Things like foodborne illness and typhoid kept popping up, and the newly established health department had to step in. As I mentioned, the end kind of came fast, and 6 years later, in 1927, the last New York City oyster bed was closed in Raritan Bay. Now, one individual New Yorker that I think was a little synonymous with this ecological neglect and later the comeuppance by way of typhoid is none other than the Irish cook Mary Mallon, who came to be known as Typhoid Mary. Now, Typhoid Mary was the original super spreader. We think about, this now, it really kind of feels a lot more germane than it did even 15 months ago. She was asymptomatic, but infected a lot of people. The real culprit, obviously, was oysters, or better yet, New Yorkers who were tainting the oysters with our waste. She never got sick, and she kept getting other people sick, so she didn't really agree with her sentencing, but she was sentenced to live here, as we see this tiny little island in the East River just off the shore of the Bronx called North Brother Island, and the slightly smaller speck of land below it is South Brother Island. She was sentenced here a couple times to quarantine. The first time she was let go, and she immediately went back to work, which was something she agreed not to do. But here we had this poor immigrant woman who didn't have a lot of skills, and it wasn't like people were really tripping over themselves to hire uneducated Irish in that time. So she went back to what she knew, which was cooking, and she kept getting people sick. I had read somewhere that she changed her name. I like to joke that she changed it to Typhoid Gretchen, or maybe even Sciatica Mary. But the truth was, she did eventually get caught and was sent back to North Brother Island, where she would live out the final 3 decades of her life in exile, and having never shown any symptoms of typhoid. What's more, but and North Brother Island is, we're getting a little bit off track here, but North Brother Island is something to work to know a little bit about, and it's interesting for our conversations here. There was this quarantine hospital, there were schools and power stations and things like that, and then we just sort of went away in the 1960s. It was a habitat that we altered because we had to alter and make a quarantine hospital because we had so badly altered and damaged another habitat. Our own pollution created the need for this quarantine hospital. And in an odd and sort of unlikely reversal, nature has since taken North Brother Island back, and now it's a protected bird sanctuary. I've never been, so this is actually just a little bit of behind the scenes in my writing of the book. I have a whole other chapter about North Brother Island and the black-crowned night herons that live and nest there, and how it's protected. And I wrote to the Parks Department and said, hey, I'm writing a book, so when can I get out there? And they said, not a chance. So even if you're writing a book about New York City's wildlife, they really won't let anybody out there. There might be volunteer opportunities every couple of years, and I'm keeping my ears peeled for that, but I'm not holding my breath to get out to North Brother Island. But it does look pretty cool, and I like to call it a life-size diorama of what would happen if the rest of New York City, if us humans just went away. And I'm reading here that Howard Weber is talking about the site of the General Slocum disaster, and that's correct. There was a fire on a German not tourist boat. It was like a Sunday revelry boat, because everybody works 6 days a week, and a fire broke out on the General Slocum right away, and all of the victims were sort of not just washed up, but they ended up on North Brother Island. And it was, I think, prior to 9/11, one of the worst single day disasters in New York City history. So lots of cheery topics here. We're going to move right along. So obviously New York City stopped eating their oysters then. For one, there were a lot fewer of them, and the ones that were there would make people sick. And it's to me a pretty stunning example of squandering and wasting this incredible natural resource that New York City had. It's not the only example of New York City ruining the environment and sort of ruining this natural wealth that we had at our fingertips, but given the amount of oysters that were once here, it definitely seems like the biggest example. And eventually, by the 1970s, 50 years after our oyster beds were cleaned up or were closed, we finally sort of got our act together and passed the Clean Water Act, which was, on the one hand, monumental legislation, and on the other hand, kind of the least we could do. This did give a respite to the harbor for pollution and things like that, but it was also too little, too late. And New York City oysters would survive as a species, but they would not be fit to eat again anytime soon. And the image here, I will just point out, and this is another sort of plug for another chapter in my book. This is a striped bass, and it was just before the Clean Water Act in the late 60s. Fishermen in the Hudson River were noticing that they weren't able to get their striped bass catches that they used to, and they really chalked it up to all these local polluters. General Electric was one, Pennsylvania Railroad, I believe, was another one, and really fought for the Clean Water Act and the EPA and things like that. And the Hudson was really very damaged by this. It was, dead zones, toxic, totally poisoned and polluted. But one of the silver linings of that is that it really did give birth to what we, now would call the modern environmentalist movement. And the Hudson itself has recovered, not completely, but pretty spectacularly given where we were just 50 years ago. And it's also given where we still are, and this is a picture of the Gowanus Canal. I was so excited last week because the East River by Williamsburg and by Greenpoint had 3 dolphins, swimming around in it last week. But it's a great sign of where we are, but there's still a lot of work to do, and it's important to remember that just a few decades ago, the ecological outlook here was pretty grim, and this was really, the late 60s and the dark days of New York. I like to say in the book that, people left the city, but the animals did too. And so, the Gowanus Canal here is improving. They don't have oysters that grow to the size of dinner plates anymore. They might have a few oysters, but they are it's a reminder of some of the damage we've done to the city and how much work we still have to do. And that's why, basically oysters have been off the table, figuratively and literally, as it were. And I think that really speaks to the quality of the oyster. And one of my favorite things about the oyster is that they really reflect their surroundings. Unfortunately for us, if people are living near them are thoughtless and dirty and polluting and not treating their wastewater, that's going to show up in the oyster. And the typhoid-stricken meat is just a manifestation, in my mind, of New York City's ecological sins. And as we were saying, the history with New York City and oysters is really one of neglect and foolishness. And we're talking about Mark Kurlansky's book earlier in the talk, and that's sort of where his book leaves off. It's like there was this, it kind of ends on sort of a bummer, and it's nothing against Mark. I mean, that was the story. And I think that's just based on when he wrote it, because since he's written it, there really is sort of a new thinking about what we can do with oysters. And looking ahead, it would really be smart for New York City to make amends with the oyster, given all that the oyster could do for New York. For one, oysters are a keystone species. They, attract all different kinds of marine life around them, little organisms up to crabs and fish. So they really are, you put oysters in the water and a lot of really good things can start happening. One really great thing that can start happening is it can reduce storm surges. Now, that may sound like a hypothetical, but of course, during Superstorm Sandy, had the oyster beds been in place as they were, prior to 1609, it definitely stands to reason that there would have been less destruction and less damage. What we're looking at here is a proposal by a great group called Scape Landscape Architecture, and they have projects all over the country, all over the world, and they really have these innovative, very smart, clever solutions to sort of the new ecological paradigm that we find ourselves in, and working with the damage that we've done and sort of making smart decisions looking forward. And one of those is what we're looking at here called the living breakwater. Now, this structure out in the water here is actually oyster beds that are reinforced with concrete and rebar. And what they're saying here is that as the storm comes in, it's going to, be attenuated by these oysters, just sort of getting in the way, and not only just getting in the way, but also providing a habitat and doing all sorts of, amazing things. This is another look at pulling back a little bit at where the project would be implemented in southern Staten Island. Down here to the left of our screen, that's an area called Tottenville, which was really, really banged up by Superstorm Sandy. And incidentally, their town motto was "the town that oysters built." And now their best chance at survival is to actually build oysters. So more to come on that, but it's just indicative of what oysters can do, and also of what these folks at Scape Landscape are thinking outside the box. But obviously, the real party trick that oysters have is filtering water. One oyster can filter 50 gallons of water a day, which is almost unbelievable. I love this image, and it's pretty self-explanatory, but we're looking at two tanks of water, and presumably the one on the left was just as dirty as the one on the right. But you add some oysters, and suddenly there's a lot more clarity. Now that's a nice little image, but what that leads us to, obviously, is one of my favorite group of New Yorkers, our friends at the Billion Oyster Project. And Billion Oyster Project gets their name from that equation that we just talked about, that little bit of math. It's a little bit of back of the envelope math, that if we could reintroduce 1 billion oysters into New York Harbor, those 1 billion oysters could clean the harbor every 3 days. And not only that, they would also, attenuate storms. They would also, attract other marine life. So there's really a lot that the oyster can do for New York City. These are their updated statistics. And one thing I will point out, and I want to talk about all of them, but the 47 million live oysters restored. Now that's just, don't check my math. I think that's 4.7% of the way towards the goal. So they definitely have their work cut out for them. But when I handed in my last draft of the book, which was probably about 2 years ago, that number was at 25 million. So they really are making tremendous progress. And I know they just got a new site, excuse me, in Red Hook, Brooklyn, and are really scaling up pretty tremendously. And it's a really good look for the future of the city and what's possible. And it's a real gift that they're doing. And then obviously the 1.6 million pounds of shells collected is another thing that I think kind of goes under the radar. This is a picture from Billion Oyster Project's location out on Governor's Island. Now, they also work with the Harbor School, which is a maritime vocation school in New York City public school system. And these are students that are hoping to be maritime biologists or what have you. And these shells are collected from restaurants that serve oysters. And these oysters these shells are going to be blended with larvae and spat and other, baby oysters basically, and they will actually attach to the substrate, or this will act as the physical substrate, the actual physical building blocks necessary to make new oyster reefs, which is great in its own right. But if I can just, take a brief tangent here, that's 1.6 million pounds. That was at 1.6 million pounds that's not going to a landfill. So before Billion Oyster Project, those shells went into a trash bag, and that trash bag went to, prior to 2001, it went to Fresh Kills landfill in Staten Island, and you had to emit a ton of gas in the truck just to get it there. I mean, and then it sits in a landfill in some community that doesn't want it. So this is just really just spectacular what they're doing on so many levels, and also just what they're doing with kids. Showing kids like a different way of interacting with their environment. And these are where the oyster shells go next. They're sort of reinforced with some rebar, and they're all over the place. They're in off of Red Hook, they're off of Governor's Island, they're off of Soundview up in the Bronx, and they really are ramping up everything that they're doing. So it is pretty remarkable. And I don't want to like paint with a magic wand here, because New York City has a lot of work cut out for itself as far as ecology and as far as pollution is concerned. And while the oyster is doing some pretty incredible stuff, I mean, I don't think it can really erase all of our sins. But what I'd love to just mention here is, I was talking to some folks at the Billion Oyster Project a long time ago, and I kind of went in with this notion like, wow, you really are going to save the day. And, the guy said to me, he's like, just be careful. New York Harbor is in a lot of ways unrestorable. It's not restorable by us. There are things in there like mercury and heavy metals that, even an oyster can't really help with. But it is helping. And, it is, like I say, it might remain it seems like a long shot, given where we were 50 years ago, given where the Hudson River and the harbor was, New York City in general, the country in general. But, the oysters are down there below the surface, working for the benefit of New York Harbor. They're outnumbered at the time, as of now, but they're definitely leaving the water a lot cleaner than they found it, and certainly a lot cleaner than we left it. And yeah, these are just some pictures of some of the kids at the Maritime School. This is in Brooklyn Bridge Park, near where I live, and that's another location where they have oysters. And here's another shot of that. And I want to just there's another quote I wanted to just mention from the New York Post. That oysters are unique among shellfish, and that they build their beds vertically upon the shells of expired ancestors, which I thought was pretty poetic for the New York Post. Yeah, and I think we moved through this a little quickly, but this is a picture of me cleaning up oysters at the Governor's Island at the Harbor School. And yeah, thanks so much for listening. And I guess, Justin, we can turn it over to some questions if there are any. You can look here myself.
Yes, we do. We have 2 questions. And again, if you have questions for Tom, please put them in the question function. I had been loading up the chat with a lot of great links to books that you were talking about.
I saw that. Yeah, that's great.
Books that I also are foundational good New York City history books. But let's go to some questions and we can go back to those. So Jeffrey Bernard asked, how was Typhoid Mary diagnosed if she was asymptomatic?
As I understand it, I think it was an early form of contact tracing. Like, I don't think they called it that, but I think that's essentially what was happening, and it kept coming back to her. And I think that was part of the problem, was that she didn't show any symptoms, and I think she really denied it her whole life. And I think that's, I'm joking calling her Typhoid Gretchen, but there is a certain amount of tragedy there, that she really didn't, have any signs of it, didn't believe that she had it. And the New York Health Department, in their limited, understanding of disease and things like that, had to do what they could. And, typhoid and other epidemics, that's a whole other topic, but typhoid epidemics in the city have been a huge problem. And obviously that sounds so obvious now, but, it's typhoid, yellow fever, cholera. These things have been real challenges to New York City and really urbanization and civilization as with a broad stroke. But they didn't really know what to do, so they said, well, everybody you were around had it, and it just kept coming back to her. So I don't think they called it contact tracing, but that would be basically the unofficial name for it.
Yeah. It was deductive reasoning almost, basically.
Yeah.
Of course. The one thing which was interesting that you mentioned, which I know is a theme throughout this talk, is the pollution, because most of our pandemics or epidemics in New York City, I guess with the exception of this one and maybe the flu of 1918, has been because of pollution. Tainted water supply, tainted food supply, which is, one of the things people didn't really quite understand about urban living and waste management and all that. Mary Shanahan asked, are there any plans to bring New York's oyster beds to pre-pollution condition and be safe to eat?
The guy I spoke to at Billion Oyster Project basically said not in our lifetime, and he kind of laughed at the question, because I had the same question. You're thinking a billion oysters, all the conditions, the water flow. I mean, it's not still the same harbor, right? I mean, it's not, but all the rivers are still flowing in, and the same salinity levels probably. But you'd think, I don't want to say no, because I wouldn't believe that there would ever be a dolphin swimming off the coast of Williamsburg, or humpback whales up on the Hudson River, or any of the other sort of remarkable natural comebacks that have happened here in the city. But I'm not going to be the first one to try them. I'm not going to, in my professional opinion, I'm not going to eat those oysters. And I think that's, I kind of talked about it a little bit, but I think, one of the dirtiest secrets of New York City is that, we treat our wastewater, and that gets treated on sunny days or dry days. But anytime it rains, there's not really a polite way of saying this. All of the shit goes right into the water, and it actually still goes into Jamaica Bay. If you're at JFK, I think it's like one of the long-term parking lots, near the air train. There is a sign. It's like, yeah, this is combined sewer overflow. Like it's happening right there. It's happening all up and down the shoreline. And that's just the product of our centuries-old sewer system. And I don't know what the solution is to fix that, but I'm not going to eat an oyster, in New York, and certainly not like the day after it rains. It's something I say to people, like, if you want to swim in New York City, like, do it after like 10 days of like, dry weather. Like that would be the time to do it.
I know there are oyster farms in Long Island Sound off of the, most of Connecticut. And even those, I'm like, I don't know. I mean, and they have really great success rate, and their oysters are supposed to be delicious. But I'm a big oyster fan. But I'm like, oh, that is, Long Island Sound had a really rough history too.
Yeah, yeah, and I just think that there's so much that they can. I mean, I just think that there's such good things happening right now with us. Not because we're not eating them, but they're doing so much for the city right now, and there's the potential once that 45 million becomes 1 billion.
Yeah.
That, we're talking reduced storm surges, we're talking better marine habitats, we're talking cleaner water, that, if they don't make it onto the menu, like, that's fine by me. And I will just say the other thing about the math is that, and I think this is probably self-evident, but if we were to leave those, Billion Oyster goes bankrupt tomorrow, that number is still going to go up because it's going to compound itself. Like those beds are sort of naturally multiplying, as it were, right now. So that does juice the numbers a little bit for them. So anyway, just a mathematical aside as best as I can do.
They're incredibly resilient. And that was one of the things I remember. I think I read The Big Oyster in 2006 when it came out, and I was like, I didn't know much about them. I was a clam guy. We were clammers. And I just gained an incredible respect for oysters and it just what their history and what they could do, and the fact that they are just incredibly resilient creatures.
Yeah. And like, we were talking about the how they were really like a delicacy, or not a delicacy, rather, they were a staple for the poorer quarters in the city, but they were also a delicacy. They really were like the fanciest dinners and the poshest banquets had, a lot of oysters, which was also part of the problem. You would, get a course of like 20 oysters to eat by yourself. So it really was this sort of food that transcended class. Like you wouldn't see like the poshest New York City, dinner now, like having a soubrette hot dog, though that would be funny. There's just not much else that really goes both ways the way the oyster did,
That's true. That was also a fascinating thing, is the how like people from all around the world would come to New York to eat oysters, and it's like we just are dumbfounded by that concept. Really?
Yeah, right. Yeah, and also, I mean, part of the problem for the oyster was that there were all these advances in shipping and cooling, and you could like keep things okay in a store, refrigerated car for a couple of days. So that actually also sped up their demise, because it wasn't just New Yorkers. It was people in Albany, people in Chicago, that, and it did have that sort of, that status. It wasn't just an oyster, it was a New York City oyster, which, made it a little bit more special.
Cool. So I think we might have answered. So Jane Carlin asks, is it safe to eat oysters from New York Harbor? Now, I think we covered that. Leslie, have they put oyster reefs in the Hudson River yet?
Yes. I remember hearing a story when the Tappan Zee Bridge was the Tappan Zee Bridge was demolished, and the Mario Cuomo Bridge, the new Tappan Zee, was being built. When the new one was being built, there were oyster beds that were that had been reintroduced, where the pilings and the support were going, where the towers were going, for the bridge. And the city spent some, at first blush, some crazy figure, not the city, the state, paid some crazy figure to relocate those oysters. And, the headline was like, state pays $10 million to move oysters like 200 yards. But the more nuanced look at that was like, well, that's how valuable those oysters are. It was worth it to the state to, keep them in the water and move them, I don't remember if it was 100 yards or a mile, but it was, in the area. But yeah, oysters are definitely in the Hudson. And I think the salt line changes. I'm not really entirely sure what the salt line is, but they're within that.
Okay. Chris asked, was the oyster a topic of interest for you prior to writing the book?
Yeah. It was. My family just loves oysters, and we have like a pre-Christmas like family holiday called Oyster Day, where we used to be at Grand Central Oyster Bar, but now I'm like the only family member who still lives in New York, so it got moved up to the suburbs. But it's just like the Friday before Christmas, like we all get together and just eat as many oysters as we can, and no one's gotten sick yet, which is great. And I will just say this is a complete aside, but my nephews, growing up, thought Oyster Day was like a thing that everybody did. So they would go back to school and ask their friends what they did for Oyster Day. And it was just, nobody knew what that was. So yeah, oysters are I was thrilled when I saw that Mark Kurlansky book for the first time, because I was like, man, I love New York. I love oysters. Let me get into this book.
It was so great.
Yeah.
And also your sister is up on the vineyard, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
That's one of the best places on the East Coast to get. Those oysters are like gold as far as
and actually, when you can return to the Grand Central Oyster Bar, they have, and I think this is also one of the questions, like where would the oysters come from that we eat in New York City? Well, they come from Martha's Vineyard in part, and they're not just Martha's Vineyard, like they have like Katama oysters and
shell marks.
Yeah, and it's on the board, and that changes with what they have day by day, but and I think they're coming from Long Island. They also come from the West Coast, which always seems odd to me, in this age of carbon footprints. It's like we have so many oysters on the East Coast that to eat something that was flown here from Washington State seems a little wasteful, but what can you do?
Hot tip, my father is he's a biologist and a food technologist, and he always said to me, and we both love shellfish, he said, don't eat oysters from the South. Up here, he said, if you can get them down south, that's fine, but he said they don't travel well. I don't know about the West Coast, but they don't. There's too much going on. I said, I've never have, because we do have good oysters here. And that Lorraine's question. A lot of Oyster Bar in their heyday, pre-pandemic and hopefully post-pandemic, had anywhere upwards of 30 different varieties of oysters that they would sell throughout a given day. And usually chill marks were the ones coming from Martha's Vineyard, but Blue Points were a big seller there. I had a good friend who was from Blue Point, Long Island.
I've even seen Katama Bay there, which was amazing. And I will say, and this just reminds me that there was a talking about like the safety of the oyster. There used to be the rule of thumb was that you never ate oysters, or you only ate oysters in months that had an R in it. So September to April was safe, but you would never eat an oyster in May, June, July, or August, because.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I think that probably has to do with the heat and food spoiling, but that was just sort of like, if there's no R in the month, move on from the oyster.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I eat a lot of oysters in August. Okay.
Yeah, and it's like, you think about it, you're like, all I want to do all summer long is eat oysters every day.
Exactly.
Better refrigeration now, I guess. Yeah.
Santorini asks, can you talk a little bit about the impact of canning and refrigeration on the oyster bays? I've heard that canning was sort of the nail in the coffin for all of our beds. Well,
absolutely. And I think that's, and this is a familiar story, but, it's market pressure, and I'm not, trying to be so anti-capitalist here, but it really was like you introduce a market for something and the market has no restraint on that. Right. I mean, there is, we're going to sell that as fast as we can, and refrigeration and canning, and also refrigeration, as I recall, like in the train cars was like a big thing, because then you could go for a week, but that was really one of the innovations that really sped up the demise. Because I don't think the fishing technology has changed like at all in like 300 years. I think they're still pulling them out of the water in the same way they always have. But this was, one of my other interests is the story of the American bison. I mean, when they were able to like find a market for that, and there were a lot of other things happening in that ecological, nightmare, but market demands there too. I mean, and that's market demands is what, hurts the fishing industry. It's what hurt the That's why there were no beavers in New York City for 200 years. There are now because of, the Bronx River Alliance and things like that. I think there were like 3 or 4 in the city, but, you put this innovation and market demand in combination, and the resource will spend itself out. And that's the story of the oyster, but there's 100 other stories like that. I mean, most of the endangered species we look at, that was what was happening. They had the Audubon Society, I think, started because people were putting all those feathers in their hats for all these endangered birds in the Everglades, and people had to, beg people to stop producing hats that way for the sake of migratory birds. So, I mean, there really are like a lot of examples of that as far as like market colliding with the natural world.
I'm going back. I'd switch over to the chat tab to see if there's any questions there. And Hunter asked, will it be feasible to eat New York City oysters again? Thanks, great talk. I think, again, we covered that. Probably not in our lifetime, but who knows?
Yeah, but, I would say not in our lifetime, but I just feel like, I wouldn't have, I grew up on Long Island Sound, and I never thought there would be a humpback whale anywhere near New York City.
True.
And it can, it really kind of depends on what the choices we make. And I will just say that, rehabbing all of the sewer pipe in New York City is probably not going to happen in the way that would help the oyster. We're probably not going to separate our stormwater and our sewage anytime soon. I mean, that's a huge undertaking, right? That's ripping up every street. But there are things that we can do to mitigate that. And one of the solutions that I really am a huge fan of for a number of reasons, and I do talk about in the book a little bit, are rooftop gardens and rooftop farms. Because what you're doing there is that stormwater is being captured by soil and is recycling naturally into the atmosphere instead of going down into the sewer. Not only that, it's growing vegetables, it's growing fruit that then can just be, I buy my hot sauce from Brooklyn Grange that's made on the roof of the Navy Yard. That is like walked to my grocery store. So you're saving gas, you're saving carbon footprint, and you're also protecting the maritime ecosystem, which I think that connection is not always made, that a rooftop garden is actually really good for fish, and it's really good for oysters, and it's really good for whales and dolphins and things like that. So I'm a big fan of rooftop gardens, obviously. And also, and Mayor Bloomberg has a great book that he wrote with the co-founder of the Sierra Club. It's called Climate of Hope, and the other guy's name is Carl Pope, and they rhyme. But asphalt is not permeable or absorbent, I think is, so the water just runs right off it.
Right.
That's runoff. So if you could, start to introduce, and again, sounds like a tall order, but if you could start to introduce a more permeable and more absorbent form of asphalt, so the water could actually just go down into the water table and not run off into the sewer, that can make a big difference too. We're not going to change the amount of precipitation. If anything, the amount of precipitation is increasing. So the problems with the combined sewer overflow system are only going to get, further exacerbated. But there are a lot of things we can do. And I think, not to, it always comes back to the book, but like, that's one of the things that like, I hope to impart is like, there are these funny stories, there are these like histories that we don't know, but there are also these connections, between a rooftop garden and an oyster bed. Like they are a lot more closely related than I think we realize. And I think that, once you're aware of that, as I call it, New York's dirty little secret about every time it rains, you step back, you'll remember that the next time you're out on the sidewalk and you see rivers of storm water flowing down the street. You put that in your head, you're like, that means shit going into the water. And excuse my French, but like that's the connections that I think we need to make, because that's going to inform the decisions we make, and that's going to inform policies and construction and things like that. So.
Yeah, totally agreed. When the pandemic hit and we were struggling to find outdoor space that was sort of private, there was kind of like this idea of look to the roofs. There's an amazing amount of space that we don't utilize in the city on the rooftops, and that's a really good rally call for that. And
the other one, and this is like one of my recent battle cries is, and I'm I don't want to lose any of the audience here, but street parking is a huge drain on space. And if you could replace, one, parking spot on every block with like a little rain garden, I mean, that would actually, that would make a difference. Not to mention like the environmental damage that a car does. And look, I'm a driver, I get it. But, there are a lot of things, there's a lot of space that we could be thinking about differently. And I think it's just about making that connection. Like, it's not just, it's not just a pretty garden. Like it's a pollinator. It's good for birds. It's good for children. It's good for asthma. It's good for even the oysters. It's good for the dolphins. So it really is all connected.
Good point. Jeffrey Bernard said, I assume that if our rivers are repopulated with oysters, fishing for them would be more closely monitored. You bet it would. I'm just going to say yes, but you could definitely jump in there, Tom.
Yeah, no. Was he saying, are they more monitored? Is the fishing? Oh, here it is.
No, they will be. Will they be more monitored?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody would recommend it. Well, and also like the oyster beds, I think the only oyster beds that are in the city are the ones that were put in by a billion oysters. So I don't know.
I think so too. I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, they're not really, I don't know. I mean, I've fished in the East River. I've caught bluefish and striped bass like right outside the UN. I mean, I wouldn't eat it every night or maybe ever again, but I did, and I'm still here to tell the story. So, I mean, I think we're getting closer to that day where we can, eat food out of the river. But I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to be the first one to do it. And I think that if you go to Brooklyn Bridge Park and you go to East River Esplanade and things like that, any of these shoreline places, I mean, I think there are pretty clear warning signs about how much fish you should take and what the recommendations are. My memory is that, a person in young, good health shouldn't eat more than once a month, and a woman who wants to be pregnant any time in her life should never eat them. It's something pretty drastic like that. So yeah.
It proceed with caution.
Yeah.
Thomas Hynes said, great talk, Tom and Justin. Well, thank you. This is all Tom. I live in Maryland, not far from the Chesapeake Bay, and have done the deep dive on oysters, literally scuba diving in the bays for oysters. Similar things being done down here to restore oysters to help heal the bay. Really great. And on a side note, we make beautiful ornaments out of oyster shells and we bring them home from the restaurants.
That's so cool.
We did too. So my mom, every time we would go out and my dad and I would do damage to, a couple dozen oysters. She would bring the shells home and use them in the garden. And they're great. And of course, as you mentioned, Pearl Street, that's why we got the name. The Dutch used them as pavers. They're very versatile. They're great for gardening too.
I mean, and I really I want to that the idea that they're not going to a landfill. I mean, look at all the purposes we just talked about. And it's another one of my I'm getting I'm becoming really fun at parties, but I really landfills are even more detrimental and damaging than I think I even realized. You talk about environmental justice, you talk about methane and just really, and even just the gas it takes to get the trash out of New York City, because it's not going to Staten Island anymore. Thank God. It's going out of state. It's going real far away. So 1.5 million tons, I think is what it was. But even if it's pounds, that's I did the math on it. It's 300 garbage trucks worth of oysters or something like that. That's not insignificant. And, I think that, just thinking about, how we can recycle and just reduce our impact in general. And that Billion Oyster Project to me is just really doing the best work in so many ways. So many ways.
Support those guys if you can. That's amazing work that they're doing, and especially tying it into you. I mean, it's it hits all the good notes. And I want to know more about these ornaments though, because there's the people who know me know that there's two things I love in this world. It's New York City wildlife and Christmas ornaments. I actually do really love Christmas ornaments. I make my own Christmas ornaments. So if whoever said, was it Tina? It's Tina, yeah.
Send me a note. I want to see some pictures because I'm going to do that next Christmas. I cannot wait to build an oyster ornament. And, FYI, if my stepbrother is still on the chat, that's what you're getting for Christmas. So come in hot, Chris. Come in hot.
Maybe we'll do a talk at Christmas about your ornament.
Yeah, Oyster Day. Yeah, we should do a live feed from Oyster Day the next time.
We should do an Oyster Day. It's that's cool. Yeah. All right, so I have put another link in the chat to purchase Tom's book if you haven't, Wild City, 10% off if you get it through Books Are Magic, which again is a local bookstore in Carroll Gardens on Smith Street in Brooklyn. Jeffrey Bernard says, do it on Oyster Day. Yeah, it's going to be a thing.
Yeah, please do. See if they look like Santa Claus. That'd be great. Yeah, please.
Yeah, they look like Santa Claus. That's awesome.
Yeah.
and Untapped workshop of oyster show. Hey, listen,
that's an event.
It's the next chapter in Untapped's offering arts
that's an event
via Zoom. If Christmas Eve falls on a Friday, would Oyster Day be the Friday before? I don't know. We'll get back to the scheduling. This actually might have to happen now, Tom.
Yeah, I don't know. It might be the Saturday. That's a good question.
It might be a thing. If you're up on the vineyard over the summer, we're definitely going to have to go.
Yeah, I'll see you there. I will. Yeah, absolutely. Also, I have one more slide about the next talk. If I can show that.
Yes, please do, because we're very excited about the next talk. Go ahead.
New York City celebrity birds exposed. I tried to do like a real the Daily Sun mock-up on this. As you know, New York City, or maybe you don't know, New York City is like one of the best places in the world for birds. It is a migratory superhighway. We already talked about all the ecological neighborhoods and all the different birds that make their home here. We got native birds, we got immigrant birds, we got everything in between. We got escaped pets. It's going to be great. Tuesday, April 27th, New York City celebrity birds. They're not really going to be exposed. I just was going for the tabloid treatment. But
I was recently filmed doing a series about luxury apartment buildings, the history of luxury apartment buildings, and of course, we talked about the Red Falcons.
There's a whole chapter in Wild City about Pale Mail. I mean, Mary Tyler Moore, it was her building, and I know this is
it's great. I told the story that she got so ticked off, she went out and protested with everybody, and then left. She ended up moving out of the building.
And I think I couldn't find it again, but I saw a clip there's like a bunch of movies about Red Tail. There's a couple of books about. I mean, I'm not a Pale Mail, and I'm not the first book about him. I mean, it might be the third or fourth. I think when she was on Letterman, she even was like, I'm not here to promote anything. I'm here to talk about this bird on my building.
She felt very strongly about it. It's a really interesting story, so I'm glad you're covering it. I won't talk about it more because I want to talk about
Snowy Owl will be there too. I see the Snowy Owl mentioned. Snowy Owl.
All right, just don't forget about Birdland. All right, so that is on April 27th. So that's in a couple weeks. So join us back for that. It's going to be a lot of fun. This week, for insiders and for general public who are interested in joining us tomorrow, we are doing Inside the King Manor Museum with Executive Director Chelsea Brow. And she's doing something a little different. She actually has a 25-minute video that she's made exclusively for us at Untapped New York with a behind-the-scenes look at the King's Manor. So it's not going to be a talk. It's going to actually be a viewing and then a Q&A afterwards after we watch that. Then that's at noon tomorrow, by the way. On Wednesday, Rediscovering Old New York with art professor Catherine Manthorn, which is the sketches of Eliza Greatory. And I believe I'm saying that right, but I'm not sure if I got her right name, her last name. But absolutely fascinating sketches by a female artist in New York's past. Really beautiful stuff about stuff we don't remember about New York history because we weren't around. And then next week, next Tuesday, we have the Hidden Gems of Washington Heights. Our Untapped tour guide, Alan Cohen, and Morris Jamel Docent is back giving us a tour of some of the great highlights of Washington Heights and the former Morris Jamel property. And then I will be with you next Wednesday to do Secrets of New York at 12 on April 7th, where we will unpack some of the great secrets from our popular article, the 160 Best Secrets of New York. So thank you guys for joining us. Thank you, Tom. Any final parting words you'd like to say to everybody?
You know what? Get out there and enjoy your city. I mean, there's really and Untapped New York is no better place to do it. And I think one of the things about Wild City is I really want people to discover like the city they didn't know, and that's what you guys are all about. And I'm so happy to be doing this with you. I love all you guys so much, and I have forever. And so I just encourage everybody out there just to get out there and discover your city, because there's so much stuff. Even if you think you know everything, there's so much out there that just hidden in plain sight, and it's so much fun. So thank you all for being here. Except for my 7 stepbrothers who didn't come. I just want to thank the one who did show up, and also my mom who said thanks for a great talk. Thank you, Mom. Yeah, it was just really great. It was
Well,
great to be there.
we'll all look forward to crashing your oyster day. So.
Yeah.
It's going to be a thing. Thank you, Tom.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Always great to have you, not only as a speaker, but also as a contributor, which you are, for Untapped New York. And we thank all of you for coming. And remember, if you were not an insider, please feel free to try us out for a month using the code Join Us. And thank you all for coming. Have a great evening. Stay safe. This recording will be given, you're going to get it in a couple of minutes, emailed right to you when it's done. For insiders, I'll be editing it and putting it in the archives as well. So have a great night, everybody. Have a great night. Tom, can't wait to see you in a couple of weeks for Celebrity Birds.
See you soon.
Stay
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.